Hi everyone. Today we are taking an overview about laboratory cycle and setup, which is part of our WeCare solution. Today's demo is divided into two parts. The first one related to laboratory cycle, where we'll go through a full laboratory cycle starting from defining patients, making visits for these patients, and requesting laboratory tests for them. Then we'll show you how these laboratory tests are reflected into laboratory screens. After that, we will go to show you how we can define and set up our laboratories, our equipments used to analyze samples within our laboratories, and how to define our laboratory tests. We will start with the first part, and we will define a new patient by clicking on person search, new. Here we are started defining our patient information. Here are some personal information. One of the most important variable or fields we are entering here is the birth date of the patient and the gender of the patient. These two fields are very important to calculate the age and gender of the patient, to know if the results of the lab tests requested for this patient are within the normal ranges or not. So it's very important to define the birth date of the patient and to define the gender of this patient. Here we should complete the personal information and some other information related to patient type, if it's insured or not. Now we can make a visit for this patient by clicking on laboratory and choose the clinic and the doctor of this clinic. Then click on OK. Our visit is created, and now we can request a specific lab test for this patient by click on adding or add button, then choose laboratory. The system will show us here a list of all laboratory tests that are already defined in our system. I'll choose the first one, completed blood count, which is a non-lab test. I click on OK. I think we should invoice this lab test as this patient is a cash patient. After invoicing this service, the system will reflect it in laboratory screens. We have many screens here in laboratory section. The most important three screens are request, sample approvals, and results entry. Every request that's requested by the reception people are listed in request screen. The lab technician should start taking the sample from the patient, and while doing that, he should access this screen and click on sample taking. For every sample, as you know, we should approve that this sample is valid and correct for our analysis. So the lab technician also should approve and accept the sample that's already taken for this patient. So he should access this screen and choose the sample he just taken and click on accept button. Now the sample is going to be analyzed by the equipments used in our laboratory for hours, days, sometimes weeks. After that, we should fill the results for this sample in the result entry screen. The results here are filled either manually by the lab technician or automatically if we configured the equipments that are already used in our laboratory correctly in our setup and configuration. I'll show you how to the results are entered here in the result entry screen. As you see here, the lab tests this lab test CBC contains many variables. Some variables are numeric variables, and the units for them are cells per microliter. Another ones, the unit for them is percentage. Some variables are numeric, as we said, and here we have a variable that's calculated based on other variables values. MCV is a calculated variable depending on the HCT and RBC variable. I'll show you how this variable value is calculated automatically once we enter the values of RBC and HCT. If you see here, the status of this lab test is still studying. Once we enter the information here and click on save, the system will change this status to studied and will define the technician that's entered this information. I'll start filling the information in the results entry, in the results value column. Here, there are two information that I should mention. The first one is this sign, which means that this result value is within the normal range for this patient. Depending on the age and gender of this patient, the result 13 is within the normal range. So the system shows us that this is a valid result and no worries regarding this one. The second information is the equipment here. As you see, the system shows us that this information is entered manually. If we configured an equipment and this equipment has an IP address and the results read automatically from this equipment, the system will show us the IP address of this equipment and will fill all variables results automatically from this equipment. I'll complete entering other information. Now I should click on Save button and show you how the system is calculated MCV value depending on the HCT and RBC values. I click on Save. You see here the system calculated the value or the result for MCV depending on the values of HCT and RBC. The equation of MCV is HCT value multiplied by 10 and divided by the RBC value. As you see here, the system shows us the technician name and the result date and type for these results. Now the lab manager should approve these results in order to be able to print the lab result report to send them for the doctor or to give them for the patient. Approve, and the status here is changed to pre-approved, and the technician approval date and type is shown here. Now we can print the lab result report. As you see, we have a lot of information here. We have a personal information, we have a test name, variables, the results, units, and result date and time. The first part is done. Now we'll go to the second part of our demo, which is related to laboratory setup and configuration. We have a specific section here under setup. We have a laboratory definitions where we can define our laboratories used to analyze our samples. Our laboratories, either internal labs or external labs, we can define them here. We have a lot of laboratories here. We have external laboratories or internal laboratories. The second part of the definitions, we have laboratory groups, and we have where we can categorize our laboratories within groups. Then we have a sample containers, which contains all sample containers used for our samples. As you see, we have a blood sample container, a urine sample container, cytology, and other sample containers. We use this information while defining the the lab test itself. We have a lab devices here where we can define the equipments and devices that's used to analyze the samples taken from the patients. Here we can define the technical details related for each equipment where the system can integrate and read automatically the results from these equipments. The most important information here is to define the port number. We should enter the port number for our device and the device type. We have a standard device types here. We should choose one of them. Then we should decide the handshake type we use for this device definition, and the baud rate for our connection with this device. Once this device is configured correctly and started our communication with this device, the communication details and result history will be filled automatically by the data that's collected from this communication. Now we will go to lab test definitions. We have three types of lab tests. We have biochemical, microbiology, and pathology. I will go through the cycle of biochemical definitions, how we can define a biochemical definition for a lab test of type biochemical. Let's take this example, completed blood count. We have some information in the header and other information in the lines related to the variables of this lab test. The header information are our laboratory group, where we can define a group and we can classify each one of these groups to a more detailed groups if we want. Now we have a generic groups here. We can choose one of them. And the result type, we can define if this lab test is a single variable or multivariable or report. If it's a single variable, then we can define only variable for this lab test. If it's multivariable, we can define many variables for this lab test, like the CBC1. And if it's report, we can write a report as a result for this lab test. Then we define the sample container we just talked about in the previous step. We have all sample containers here. For CBC, we have a blood sample container. If we have an estimated time or estimated duration for our lab analysis, we can define it here. And if this lab test is related to patient blood type, we can click on OK on button here. Now we can start defining the variables, as this lab test is multivariable, so we can have many variables beside this lab test. We start defining them one by one by clicking on OK button. We should define the test name and choose the variable type. We have a lot of variable types here. If the variable type is a numeric, then the result should be entered as a numeric value in result values screen. If it's text, we should write a text. If it's choice from list, we should define here choices that we should choose one of them in the result screen. Calculated, we should define an equation here depending on other variables to calculate the value for this variable in results screen. As you see here for the MCV, it's calculated, and it's calculated based on the two variables, RBC and HCT, and here we have the formula where the HCT multiplied by 10, then divided by RBC. Here we can define the unit for every variable, and if it's numeric, we can define the decimals for this numeric value. Then we can define the equipment that is used to analyze this variable. For every variable or for every lab test, we have an equipment that's used to analyze the samples that are taken for such lab tests. And finally, we can define the normal ranges here, depending on the age and the gender of the patients. As you see, we can choose the gender, if it's male or female, minimum age in days, weeks, months, or years, and the maximum age, and the normal value related to this criteria. I think here we're done with our second section. I hope the demo was clear and helpful for you to understand our laboratory cycle and setup. See you next demos.